Do you believe that people fall out of love? You want to go first or second?
I went first last time.
Is that a no?
No, I'll go first again. That's fine.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I think that a lot of it has to do with your definition of love. I think that, sometimes people feel like they are, they think that they're in love with someone when maybe it's more of an infatuation. And so something like that wears off. I just want to kick it straight to you because I know you have a few thoughts on this question that we've talked about before, and I don't want to waste time. Let's just kick it right over to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's I was actually thinking about a few weeks ago, you and I were out of town, and Brent Allen preached at the church, and we're in a series where it's called "There's More to the Story." So we're looking at texts that, like, on the surface are like, "What in the world is that?" And then you go, "There's more to the story," right? So the one, Jesus is saying, "Hey, unless you hate your mother and brother and father and husband and wife and children, you essentially have no part with me, or you're not worthy to be my disciple," right? Which is like a jarring thing to read. Like, well, what in the world is Jesus saying there, right? Certainly Jesus isn't saying you should hate your family. It's hyperbolic. Right. And essentially he's talking about the difference between,
He's emphasizing the space between the two.
Yeah, like that you shouldn't have any idols or anything like that, right? And that your love for me should be so much greater than for anybody, even your family, right? So then we start talking about that even more deeply. Brent and I were discussing it when he was sharing with me what he was going to preach. And as I was thinking about the text, I was thinking, like, usually when we hear love, we immediately attribute affection to love, right? So you think of love and affection as one and the same. Mm-hmm. So, it seems like what Jesus is saying there is, unless you have way more affection for God than you have for your spouse or your kids or whoever, then you can have no part with me. But I don't think that the text really has anything to do with affection. I don't think that's what's being said there. Because obviously, God is a spirit, you are tangible. I look in your eyes, we make contact with each other. We give each other gifts. We give each other words of affirmation. Like, there's all of those exchanges, right? And affection comes through reciprocity. Mm-hmm. So when you reciprocate love and you exchange it, then affection builds. But you can have love without high levels of affection. And I was actually thinking about our kids, right? Like, I love our kids equally, but I don't have equal amounts of affection for them. My relationship with Ella, there's a lot of reciprocity. We have conversation, we affirm each other, there's all of that, right? She gives me hugs, we spend quality time together. Hudson, with his autism, he doesn't reciprocate. In fact, most of the time, just shooting totally straight, like most of the time, Hudson makes life more difficult. And I embrace it, and you embrace it gladly. Like, and we do it. And part of our love, like really our love for him, is built on our showing up for him, giving the best we can, consistently, faithfully, day in and day out, to show up as the best mother and the best father we can, even when there's
not all the warm fuzzies,
or sometimes no reciprocity, right? We deal with sometimes primarily and sometimes exclusively negative emotions in relationship. He does sometimes make life very frustrating and difficult. And yet, even though the feelings aren't always affectionate, the consistency and the faithfulness really is where the love is. And so, back to that text, I don't think Jesus is trying to get us to dampen our love for our family members or our affection for our family members, or even go, wow, I feel guilty because I should have more affection toward God. But I think what he's talking about is ultimately faithfulness and obedience and all that kind of stuff. So to this question, can someone do people fall out of love? I think it's probably linking those two. It's going, hey, I feel less affection than I ever have toward this person, and maybe it's coming from a lack of reciprocity. I'm doing all the giving. I'm not really getting anything back. It's been that way for a while. Therefore, my love tanks have run dry, so to speak. And sometimes even, again, people start hurting one another. And so, they're starting to count the costs like, hey, we're trying to make this work. It's not working. And so I think, again, the question comes down to in the relationship, if I'm trying to make sense of how I'm feeling about this, how would we jumpstart affection would be, we have to decide, are we willing to live in a loving reciprocal relationship,
Right.
and to rebuild affection. And again, how do you do that? Well, through the love languages, right?
Yeah.
What am I saying to this person? Words of affirmation, quality time. Have we spent quality time together? Are we appropriately touching one another? Are we physically affectionate? Are we serving one another, and all of those things, right? But I think, again, what sometimes love means being faithful even when affection is low. And I think what happens a lot of times in, again, romantic relationships, that's my assumption on this question, is probably coming from, somebody who's been romantically intertwined with someone, in love with them, and they're like, I don't feel what I used to feel. And I think at some point in relationships, people have to decide, are we going to do this the way that it's meant to be, which is reciprocate, and which takes two willing people to do that. So I think that's the crossroads. Like, that's probably dwindled because there's a lack of reciprocity. So affection has gone by the wayside, and then that loss of affection we would call falling out of love. That's what people would call it. And I think, again, it's a simple formula to get it back. The question is, are two willing parties willing to go there and pay that price and do that?
I think it is also important to differentiate that for someone like Hudson, there's a lot of it that is just, it's an incapability.
Oh,
for
absolutely.
him, right? Like, it's an actual physical, mental,
Right.
Issue that is causing him to be able to reciprocate.
Yeah.
Typically in a marriage, that's not the case.
Yeah.
It's the other person has chosen to stop showing affection. And often that is a symbolic thing of, they're not investing love into the relationship. And so that's where I think what you said about it being two people, like, even if you decide that you're like, I'm gritting my teeth and I'm getting into this, you can't hold a marriage together by yourself.
Yeah.
You can't hold a relationship together by yourself. It does have to be two people. And that's where you have to come to the table and talk about, like, is this something we can fight for? Or is this just, I don't want to let it go, and the other person has decided, like, I'm checking out. And the loss of affection is really symbolic of the fact their heart's not there. So
Yeah. I mean, my love for our kids and your love for our kids has nothing to do with reciprocity. If they never reciprocated one time, we would love them just the same. But affection is affected by reciprocity.
Sure.
Right. So we go, in that scenario, in that context, I'm going to love you. And one of the things I had to come to peace with Hudson was, I always felt like I wasn't a good dad in my heart, even though my head knew I'm doing the best I can, because I felt like if I loved him better, I would have more affection. I felt like, look, man, this kid didn't ask for this autism thing. He didn't ask for this. And I felt like if I loved him like he deserved to be loved, I would feel higher volumes of affection. And it took a while for me to realize, no, affection comes from reciprocity, and based on his context, he doesn't give that back. And actually, in some ways, it's the greatest act of love maybe I've ever done in my life, to be so faithful and so consistent with someone that gives me nothing back, right? And again, it's my son, and he can't help himself. Like, he didn't ask for this. And most of the time in marriages, or romantic relationships, it's people who, for whatever reason, have decided they're not willing to try to reciprocate anymore. And that's where it's heartbreaking.
Right.
It comes to this place where you have to decide, like, are two people, like, we can stir this affection back up, but it's going to take us, serving one another, loving one another, and showing it back and forth.
Yeah. I think that that is one of the key differences between a, peer-to-peer relationship, like a romantic relationship versus a parenting one. And I hope that, that being vulnerable like you just were is helpful to a lot of parents, because I think a lot of times for various reasons, whether your kid's going through a hard time, they're going through a stage, where they just want nothing to do with you, or they went through, whatever it is, like they're making life hard,
Yeah.
right? And honestly, let's keep it real. I mean, there are probably moms out there of babies, toddlers, right? And you're like, some days I just want to scream and run out the front door. And I hear women talk about that, and they feel so terrible because they're like, I thought I was supposed to just feel warm and fuzzy all the time, like, and it's not their fault that they're crying and pooping their pants and whatever, like they're doing what they should age appropriately do. It's okay that you don't always feel all the affection. That doesn't mean you don't love your kid. The way you choose to keep showing up for them, even when it's hard, is the definition of love.
Let me throw one more thought. I know we're in overtime, but I'll throw one more thought on it. Is I would say let's go back to like a marriage or a romantic relationship. There are times where, based on somebody's season of life, they're not able to reciprocate. Maybe they're going through like, a horrible mental health type situation, or they're going through a tragedy,
It's a great
or
call out.
they're going through like a really, really hard time. Like they're low, and like they're maybe taking more than they give, or maybe they're in a season of like where they really aren't giving anything at all. And I think there's a difference like between that and just someone who's quit on the relationship. But sometimes that season of time is like, I know this person doesn't have much to give me at all. This really isn't as reciprocal as I prefer, but it's a season. And for the season, the way I'm going to demonstrate love is by, continuing to be faithful and serving them. And
that is the definition.
Even,
that's really good.
Even though maybe you don't feel all that much affection, even though you maybe feel sorry for them, or you realize, you're hurt hurting for them. Like, but you're like, I'm actually running dry on affection, but I'm going to stay the course because I know this is a season.
That's good.